John here from Great Lakes Country, and today we're making the most amazing, juicy, succulent Italian venison meatballs. Completely from scratch, start to finish, and we're even using ground venison that came from a deer that I processed myself right outside that door not 4 days ago. Yes, we're gonna be mixing it with some pork because you need some good fat content in a meatball, much like a lot of the things you might make out of ground venison. I got a big old pile of the stuff. Of course, I'm gonna be doing sausages and burger patties and all the usual stuff. But you know what? I do love having a few bags of these homemade meatballs in the freezer to reheat and enjoy whenever I want. And yes, these meatballs freeze and reheat exceptionally well, and we're gonna go through all of that as we get further into this video. So let's get right into it and start taking a look at all of this meat that we have to grind up to make some meatballs. Now, prior to starting to shoot this video, I've already gotten a head start on processing my venison meat. I butchered a deer a few days ago. It was kind of on the small side, so I decided I'm just gonna grind the entire thing. So I took all the meat off of the bones, back straps, shoulders, hindquarters, everything, cubed it all up, and it's ready to go into the grinder. And of course, with a lot of ground venison recipes, you gotta mix it with some fattier meat or just some fat. I tend to like using pork, particularly for meatballs, because, well, most meatballs that I make otherwise would be all pork anyway. Flavors work very well together, incorporates a lot of good fat. So here I've got 2 pork shoulders, and I'm going to be doing a 50-50 ratio between the venison and the pork for these meatballs. And no, I don't need all of the meat from both of these pork shoulders. But I'm doing a couple of videos sort of concurrently here. I'm doing a burger video, I'm doing the meatball video, I might even be doing a sausage video. But in any case, I'm gonna end up needing a lot of this pork, so I've got 2 shoulders here to go along with all of that cubed up venison that still has to go through the grinder. So I'm just gonna start slicing these pork shoulders up, cutting them into some cubes, of course getting rid of the bone that's in there. So this will all be ready for the grinder, just like that cubed up venison is. And after putting those trays of cubed meat into the freezer for just a little while to get them nice and firm and super cold, we can start grinding. I'll use my medium coarse grind plate and just start feeding everything through. I'll start with all that pork and then do the venison, nothing to it, just slow and steady for a perfect grind. Now that all of our pork and venison are ground up and ready to go, let's say we actually make these meatballs. The very first thing I gotta do is take 1/3 cup of ordinary breadcrumbs and soak it in 1/2 cup of milk. You can use 2%, you can use whole milk, probably wouldn't use skim. No need to stir it, just pour it in, and then we're gonna let this sit in the refrigerator for 20 minutes, let those breadcrumbs get good and saturated. Next, we need to do a little bit of prep work, starting with 1/2 of a medium-sized yellow onion, which I just so happen to have right here. And we're just gonna give this thing a pretty standard chop, maybe a bit on the fine side, so the pieces of onion are pretty small in our grind mix, rather than great big chunks floating around in there. But really, it doesn't matter that much. Just get that onion chopped up. Next up, you know we need some garlic, about 3 or 4 cloves, depending on how big they are. And I am just gonna get these minced up. Or if you prefer, use the stuff that comes already minced in like a jar of liquid if you like that kind of thing. But you definitely wanna get some garlic in there. And lastly, we need some fresh parsley, about 1/4, 1/3 of a standard bunch of curly parsley. I'll just sort of eyeball it. Of course, you don't have to really worry about writing down or remembering any quantities right now, because as always, the entire written out recipe will be linked in the video description below. And I'll just get this all chopped up. And I don't quite need all of this to mix into the meatball mixture, but I will take about, let's call that 1/4 cup. And I'll set the rest of this aside to use for some garnish when we serve. Now let's start putting together our meatball mix. Starting off with 1 pound of that ground venison, a pound of that ground pork, and now we just have to start throwing in a bunch of stuff. Starting off with those chopped onions, the garlic, parsley, 2 eggs, 2 tablespoons of grated Parmesan cheese, 2 teaspoons kosher salt, 1 teaspoon black pepper, 1 teaspoon Italian seasoning, and a half teaspoon of crushed red pepper flakes. Lastly, we need that weird breadcrumb soaked in milk mixture, and I'll just spoon that right on in. Now, I'll just get in there with my hand and start mixing everything up. Yes, I could have used the KitchenAid mixer for this, but I don't know, it's not that hard to do. There's not too much stuff I need to mix, so I don't know, I'll save myself a few more dishes than I would have otherwise needed to do. Just get this all mixed up very thoroughly by hand. Just keep going until the whole mixture looks kind of homogeneous and it's getting pretty sticky and tacky. And that's looking beautiful to me. So now we need to cover this whole pan with some plastic wrap and put it in the refrigerator for 1 hour. It's gonna let all those dry seasonings get nice and hydrated. Everything's gonna meld together. And perhaps most importantly, it's gonna let that meat get nice and firm and really hold together so we can start shaping up our individual meatballs. All right, here we are an hour later and we're ready to make some meatballs. So I'll just grab a little bit of this meat and start forming it up into a ball. And as far as what size to make them, well, that's completely up to you. I like mine a little on the bigger side rather than making teeny tiny little meatballs. Maybe something about like that. Call that an 1.25 1.5 inch in diameter. And as I go, I'll just set them down on a little bit of parchment paper here so they don't stick to anything. And just repeat. Now I got my meatballs all arranged out on some parchment paper on one of those baking sheets. And once again, this whole thing's going into the freezer for just a little bit to allow the outside surfaces of each of these meatballs to firm up a bit, which is gonna make them a lot more durable when we get to the next step after that, which will be to sear each one of these. So I've got my big enamel Dutch oven over about medium-high heat, and we're gonna add in a little bit of olive oil. Let that get nice and hot. And then we're just setting in some meatballs. I want to give them a good, maybe medium crust all the way around. So I'll set them in and just let them sit there and cook for a minute before I turn it or mess with it or do anything. And I can only fit so many at a time in this Dutch oven, so I'll just do a few meatballs at a time, then get them out of there. If I need to add a little bit more olive oil in between each batch, then I will. Just want to give them a good sear and a nice crust all the way around because that's going to make them more delicious and it's going to also help them keep their shape and stay together through the following steps and all the way up to when it's time to eat. And I'll mention that some people say that this searing step isn't necessary and you can go straight to the oven. And I've done it that way, but I'm telling you, the results with the sear first are so much better. Better taste, better shape, they just look better. So take my word for it, don't skip that step. And as each meatball is finished searing, I'll arrange them laid out on a baking sheet that's covered in some aluminum foil just to make cleanup on this sheet pan a lot easier later on. And now the whole thing is going into the oven that's preheated to 400 degrees for about 15 minutes or until the internal temperature reaches 160 degrees. There will be a little bit of carryover heat once I take these back out of the oven, so don't worry, the inside of each one of these will reach 165 degrees. And there we have it, some beautiful seared and then roasted Italian meatballs made with venison and pork. So let's recap so far. We've made the meatballs, we've seared the meatballs, we've baked the meatballs. At this point, they're completely ready to eat if that's what you want to do. They're fully cooked, they're amazing. But personally, I think this style of meatball tastes much better if it's actually refrigerated for a while and then brought back up to temperature by simmering it in some good marinara sauce. So that's what I'm actually gonna do now for these meatballs that I'm gonna be cooking for the point of eating in this video. But all the rest of them, they're getting flash frozen and then vacuum sealed and stored in the freezer until whenever the heck I feel like eating them. Now from refrigerated, it's not gonna take that long. I'll get some marinara sauce up to a low simmer in a saucepan, drop in the meatballs, give it about 10 minutes. But if those meatballs are coming from frozen, no, I don't bother thawing them out. I do the same thing. Simmer some marinara, drop in those meatballs, but I give them half an hour. 30 minutes, they're reheated, They're warmed all the way through, and they're amazing. Some of the juiciest, tenderest, most succulent, and delicious homemade venison Italian meatballs I could ever hope for. Absolutely delicious. How could they not be? Seasoned, tender, seared, simmered in marinara sauce, absorbing lots of that amazing tomato sauce flavor. Make a sub sandwich out of them, pile them up on some pasta, eat them straight out of your hand like an apple if you have to. And whether or not you use venison or just all pork, I highly recommend trying this Italian meatball recipe. It's a great make-ahead freezer recipe that can be ready to eat in about 30 minutes with practically no work. And if you do want to make it for yourself, you know I'm going to have a link in the video description below that goes to the full written out recipe for everything. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future food and wild game cooking videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.